Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar on compost-based best management practices. This is the second in the Soil Builders Education and Action webinar series. I'm Natasha Duarte, Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. Our association believes that increasing the use of compost in our communities will improve soil health, water quality, and our resilience to climate change. We work to advance the production and use of compost and to demonstrate the value of compost through education, policy, outreach, and partnerships to reduce waste, capture energy, and create jobs. So just a little background on the Soil Builders workshops. They were developed to provide compost-related eco-literacy for Lake Champlain Basin decision makers, professionals, and advocates. I just want to add that this is a conversation that has been happening somewhat iteratively for several years now. And we think what's really been missing that we'll try to convey today is a sense of urgency around it. Collectively, we need to do what we can to help move the conversation from talking about compliance to actually taking meaningful steps towards restorative and regenerative approaches. And we need this in every sector, from agriculture to construction and road projects to general landscaping, and at every scale. So from state and municipal projects, commercial projects, down to the individual landowner. We'll be talking about some of this as we move through the content today. The Soil Builders Workshop topics include soil health and water quality. That was the first webinar we provided, and a recording of that, as well as the resources, are available on the CAV website. We're getting ready to release the drivers for clean water and healthy soil. And then today, of course, is the best management practices webinar. And then the last one is education and action, or next steps. So then we're going to be holding some more workshop type events to help figure out how do you put what you've learned during the Soil Builders workshops into practice. I'd like to take just a minute to thank all of my project partners, as well as additional thanks to my board of directors who have provided oversight and input and review along the way. And as well, I'd like to thank the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission and the Lake Champlain Basin program for their generous funding for the Soil Builders workshops. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two presenters. We're going to get started with Chuck Duprey, who's president of Naturcycle, a firm focused on the sales and marketing of compost and engineered soils throughout the Northeast. Working with a variety of private and public composters, they provide material for projects and retail use throughout our region. He currently serves on the Compost Testing Committee of the U.S. Composting Council. Chuck consults on the beneficial uses of organics, engineered soil, and stormwater projects around the country. He also works to develop and supply some of the largest green roof and engineered soil products in the Northeast. Chuck has a BS and a BA from Syracuse University and resides in upstate New York. Brian Jerose has been president of Agrilab Technologies Inc. since 2012, working on a range of composting, watershed protection, and sustainable development projects. Brian's education includes a master's in environmental and resource engineering from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and a BA in political science from SUNY Geneseo. He's the VP on the board of directors for the Composting Association of Vermont and is a board member for the Missisquoi River Basin Association. He lives in Fairfield, Vermont with his wife, Joanna, and his daughters, Maya and Lucy. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Chuck.
Thank you, Natasha. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to go through some specific compost best management practices. If you're not familiar with the term, these are the best ways to utilize compost, mostly in stormwater applications, which we'll be discussing throughout this presentation today. We pulled from a variety of different sources, like you'll hear a term I'll use multiple times today, like AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, International Erosion Control Association, U.S. Composting Council, other existing Vermont specifications, and looking at solutions and options for the Lake Champlain Basin and the best ways to manage stormwater using compost in a variety of applications. So the place to start from that aspect is the specification and how that compost gets defined and used. So again, just some of those groups we'll be referencing today and other things you can look back at later. There's four critical segments of compost use in stormwater management. You've got landscaping, athletic type applications, just to talk about a very niche kind of application that's related to landscaping. You've got direct erosion control practices for construction and roadside applications, roadside construction. You've got low nutrient applications, which I'll call important for this basin, related to bioretention or stormwater runoff, where we're concerned about nutrient levels. And then because, again, the state of Vermont and the area we're in, agriculture is another critical segment. So we've broken this presentation into four different areas to look at a compost specification and how to use it within each, and then talk about, the specifics therein. So to the right, just as an example, is the picture of a more coarse compost that might get used in erosion control. So compost and compost products, the key takeaway today is really that not all composts are created equal. There's different physical and chemical properties that affect what's the best use for that compost and how that compost should be applied. Picture below are just a few different examples of all well-made compost, but you can see they've got different physical characteristics just from a visual standpoint, and how they might be applied we'll talk about throughout this presentation. So states like Vermont, reference a term like compost labeling, just a way to describe the compost related to the testing. The critical takeaways here in this slide, and we'll talk about more in depth, are that NPK, which is a macronutrients, if you're familiar with the term, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In compost and any organic material like this is organic as in from the earth, was once alive, not organic as in whole foods and on a shelf. This type of nitrogen and these forms of nutrients are often in a form that need to be converted by bacteria or some sort of process to be available for plants. So when we're looking at compost and how we're going to use it throughout this presentation today and different applications in these best management practices, it comes down a lot to sampling and testing the compost, and we'll build on this as we continue. But a good place to start is sampling the compost you might try to use in your erosion control project or your bioretention soil or for your farm. Sampling is an important part of that. So getting a composite representative sample of the compost you might use. There's some important steps to that. The Compost Council Foundation has an excellent video on how to get a sample, an accurate representative sample of the material, and then what type of application could follow from there. So if you get your good sample, you test it along the lines we're going to discuss, what different applications might apply. So there's different ways to evaluate and test compost. We're going to look at a couple different ones today. The methodologies might vary some. So we've focused a lot on what the U.S. Composting Council created in the late 90s called the Seal of Testing Assurance Program and their TMECC test methods for the evaluation of compost and composting. It's basically ASTMs specifically geared towards compost production and applications. There are other approval and testing methods that are very viable. Groups like NOFA and OMRI have standards that might be tested at different labs. EPA has standards for metals and different pathogens that we can look at. The key really is that in some way, the best way to proceed with your compost into a best management practice is some form of testing and analysis to then determine how that should be applied and if it can be applied. So there's all these different standards and groups out there. We're going to focus a bit on STA and talk a little about NOFA as we go along well. But just to keep in mind, it really comes down to testing and analysis is the most viable way to determine how to proceed. So we're going to now hop right into some of the best management practices related to landscaping and athletic field uses, common applications that landscape architects or towns or any institutional user might need to be aware of. We're going to expand and discuss how that gets specified, how it gets applied, and some of the benefits therein. So compost utilization in landscaping and athletic field applications, this is something where you might be mixing compost with disturbed soils, applying it in some way, potentially blending to make more like an engineered soil for an application, things like top dressing. Pictured on the bottom right is what we call like compost backfill. So instead of using a chemical fertilizer when you're planting a tree or shrub, you could mix some of the existing site soil with a percentage of compost and fill around the tree to encourage root growth. Mulching is another potential use where compost might be applied in this type of segment for a best management practice, and we'll get into a bit more of each. So if we're going to use compost in combination with the soil, compost really provides three key benefits to soils and in its application. There's physical improvements, chemical improvements, and biological improvements. Those are the three benefits that AFCO, which is the American Association of Plant Food Control Officials, which is state regulators throughout the country, and this is their trade group and industry group, they allow you to say on a bag or in marketing, materials that compost can provide these three benefits. So it's independently verified that compost improves the physical structure of the soil, some of the chemical benefits you might get from those nutrients, and along with the biological, which has become very popular, nematodes, bacteria, and fungi you're reintroducing to the soils. So here are some common specs you might be looking at, or things Compost Council's put together in different groups along those lines. If you're in the landscape world or in the athletic field world, the USGA has a very detailed specification for top dressing and different uses in athletic fields, which might be very common throughout the state of Vermont for institutions and schools and towns. Might be worth taking a look at more. So just a general landscape specification kind of gives you a broad ranges of materials that any composter, large or small, should be able to make materials that fall within these type of ranges, be it manure-based or green waste or food waste compost. These methods from the TMECC I referenced earlier are done in about a dozen labs throughout the country, and they can compare apples to apples this way. So the pH methodology, the way they're testing for soluble salts would be the same. Some of the key things to look at if you're going to define compost for a landscape specific use is that you can see highlighted red at the top is they've actually defined the compost process to a bit, explaining there was a mesophilic and thermophilic phase to really signify that it's not just static material that was piled up out back, that someone is actually making a composted product for use in the landscape, which is important for soil health and to make sure you don't pass along disease and pathogens. So this spec, in common specs, you should define what the compost is and then get into the parameters. Another one that we look at quite often is some sort of stability measure. If you've heard the term Solvita, it's a proprietary test out of Maine. It's a little jar that you put a little stick in and it changes color. We'll show some pictures as we're coming along. But you can see here there's ranges the compost should fall within, the methodology, and then units. These are all things important for the end user if the landscaper or the contractor is going to go find this material, that we're clearly defining all these important factors. Some specs might not need this much detail, but kind of gives you an idea of what that might look like if I was going to specify a compost to be used in that backfill application. So we'll get a little more into maturity and stability because it's really important from a compost use standpoint and a success standpoint for the soils and for plants later. How we judge if the compost is finished. Time and temperature are important, and following the process, and good composters throughout the state of Vermont do that. And a good way to verify that from an independent standpoint are some different tests, lab scale analysis, what is commonly called compost maturity and stability. So how do you determine if that compost is finished? I mean, besides looking at the color and smell and physically touching it, there are independent lab-based analyses you can do. Pictured below is what they call a bioassay. It's a common method where you're test growing something. It's a cucumber seed in this example versus a control. So you're determining, is there something potentially negative about the compost? Is it not fully composted? Are there some potential noxious weeds or other, bad pathogens that might be present that you can compare to the control? So if your compost doesn't perform at the same level of the control or outperform it, it would be considered immature. You can also look for persistent herbicides and other things along this way. And this is a lab setting in the Midwest where they're showing you how they follow through the process. The thing that looks like a refrigerator is a growth chamber, which is an example of how you can measure how finished the compost is. So not just the maturity, the stability is another important question. So it's not just, is it viable for plant growth, but has it finished composting? They're often tied together because it's a similar process. Even Solvita and CO2 respirometry, which is the common method used by labs versus Solvita, so measure the actual amount of carbon dioxide the compost is giving off. If it's biologically very active, it's giving off more. If it's slowed down in finished composting, you can measure that level. So Solvita just does it by a color change. You can see on the left how active the compost is. On the right, again, is that Midwest lab that's a bit more scientific approach where they're doing something similar but measuring the respirometry in a lab setting versus a color change, which might be open to some interpretation. So if it's a finished stable compost, which is going to be important as we continue to discuss, that means that material is going to continue to break down in the soil. It will release a small amount of organic nutrients that are available for plants, and it shouldn't have a lot of water-soluble nutrients that could cause runoff and negative issues. So looking at some method to measure stability and maturity is really important before I go to use a compost in a soil or top dressing or other mulching application. So this general landscape application continued. Now that we're going to continue to look at the other half of it, particle size is important. Is the material screened or managed in some way that you can judge it? Again, that's open to some interpretation, but Compost Council and our common specs just use a percent passing, what they call the 3/8 sieve. Something to keep in mind just to show that the material has been managed and sized properly to be used in that application. And we'll explain a little more as we get to top dressing, how you want something smaller versus something larger. And then some sort of standard of quality. If you're writing a spec, something that says this is what we're looking for in the market, and then something to compare it to. Our specifications, and if they're in the STA program, they're testing at least once a quarter. So, shouldn't really have like last year's analysis. There should always be something fairly recent, 90, 120 days. Sometimes testing takes a while. So demanding a test be 30 days old is quite hard from a sampling and analysis standpoint, but saying there should be a recent analysis is a good thing to add into a specification. Again, Solvita referenced at the bottom, it's a common test. It's just again, if I use this term properly, it's proprietary. It's owned by a company. They only sell them in a package, where CO2 respirometry is something almost any lab can do and set up for. They don't have to buy the test from just one company. So just as an example, it's a good field test. It's something out there. But it's not something necessarily endorsed by one program or another because it's what they call proprietary. Next. So some general tips and tricks as we're moving along here. We kind of looked at how to specify generally compost for use in a landscape application. Some key things to keep in mind if you're the end user or a landscape architect or even a municipality specifying compost uses. Physical samples are something always nice to ask for. It lets you just verify that you physically are confident you're getting what you are planning to specify. A small amount, even a quart's just enough to look at. If you're looking for top dressing quality, is it really fine and 1/4 inch and dry, or is it something you're going to use for backfill and it's a little bit larger particle size? It lets you kind of judge, what am I getting relative to the job site. As compost often comes in bulk, so seeing a little bit in advance avoids some of that, potential job site concern that comes up later. This isn't what I ordered. This isn't the right fit. A good composter should be able to provide a small physical sample prior to a job at some point. Delivery options affect a lot of this just from a best management standpoint. Larger loads often are lower price point. You're dividing the material over a bigger truckload. So keeping that in mind, there are a number of small composters out there, very good, but a larger composter might have some advantages because they could deliver all 30, 40, 50 yards of material at once versus 10 yards 3 times. Very simple math, but things to keep in mind when planning and looking at these. Are there ways to package together the projects? Are you using more compost at once and helping reduce some of that cost? Something to keep in mind from a thought process standpoint, as you improve soils, you are creating potential for weed pressure. There's a strong soil bank already in most a weed bank in most soils. So once you mix in compost and spread that soil back out, you can get some weeds developing. The compost should never be the source of that. If done properly, there's no way the compost is the source. But to initially, jump to that conclusion, just consider that if you spread compost over a large area or amend a large area, unless it's an evenly distributed weed problem, that everywhere you put the compost, there's also the potential that the soil or just adding that good nutrients and good biology back allowed some of those things to germinate if you didn't get right on it. So weeding, mulching, applying your plants and seed quickly, and not allowing these big areas once they're improved to just sit, is important to reduce that weed pressure that could develop. So we'll look now at like an actual practice, compost for fill, soil applications, something that could be blended on site using that initial specification. You'd have to get into some more detail and say what specifically you're looking for, but you could apply that 1 inch of compost specified over half an acre of a new construction site and till that material to an appropriate depth. Tilling could be done with a bobcat or other small piece of equipment that can work the material back into the soil with some different attachments. And then that provides a better establishment for turf or other vegetation versus importing as much topsoil as well. From a sustainability and a carbon footprint standpoint, compost is lighter, sometimes sourced more locally. So instead of importing 500 yards of topsoil from somewhere, you could import 100 yards of compost, work it into the soil, and improve that material versus importing a full topsoil by itself. And there's a number of things you can correct and improve with using just compost. You can buffer out pH some, you can improve organic matter, which is important for plants. There's a number of different things to consider when looking at compost for a fill, soil amendment type application. So backfill is a big one that I think gets underutilized and specified, especially in an application like the Lake Champlain Basin. It's something that more landscape architects and institutions call for when planting these, shrubs, trees, any larger plant. Instead of using a starter fertilizer or importing, other material, taking in some loose compost that they could mix and backfill on each application, like we've got pictured here, to enhance that plant's survivability, the whole 9 yards. A common spec is about 2 parts soil, 1 part compost, and fill it back in. I do get some concerns that, the root spreading and the roots will only stay there. I mean, if mixed at a low enough rate, the plant's still going to encourage growth outside that. The compost does break down a little bit over time. So the idea that the roots will never leave the backfill area, unless you've maybe overdone it with the compost or the soil around that is so poor to begin with, it doesn't really seem to be, a real world problem too often in most of my cases that we've seen over the years. So you're better off to backfill than not, in my opinion. And it just comes down to, what the soil types and materials available. So when to apply these things and how to use them in the actual real world. Most times of year, backfilling could be a good application. It's something that can be done in spring, summer, or fall. Usually not viable in frozen soils, avoiding truly wet or saturated conditions. Too dry in the deep of summer can be a management issue, but watering, things like that, and then testing sometimes can take a little while. So something to keep in mind from a planning and critical, thought standpoint. If you've got a detailed spec like we demonstrate in the front, you really need to, account for the amount of time it might take to get those results in a sample. So operations and maintenance, again, continuing the best management practices here. Using that compost is a way to reduce. I would reduce my fertilizer applications. We're going to get into top dressing a bit more in a minute. But if you're going to backfill around a tree, I wouldn't add additional fertilizer to that tree unless you saw visual demand or there's a soil test that might prove you need it. You tend to have a higher success with the vegetation, meaning you're not coming back and replacing that tree or that shrub, which makes contractors and everybody else very happy. And you're going to reduce some of that erosion and runoff by improving the soil health opening that soil back up for water to infiltrate. There's a number of real benefits you get there. Something to keep in mind from an operation maintenance standpoint too. A well-made compost is something that could be staged in advance of its use. Unlike some other materials, if it's sat in a parking lot, for a few weeks prior to installing the trees or fixing an athletic field or a town park, in theory, there's no reason that material won't be very viable. It could be stored for a month or so on site. If, protected, lightly tarped, maybe kept away from direct water sources running into it. A little rain shouldn't affect the compost, but if the whole parking lot drains into the pile, that could cause a bit of a problem. And the best compost use in this application is mixing it, incorporating it with soils. The better it's mixed and incorporated throughout, the higher chance of success. So just simply spreading it out with the bulldozer and leaving it in ruts and fills is not probably going to get you a very good successful, application. Finding some way to till or disc or mix that material in, is the highest rate of success. Compost is a soil amendment and registered as such in most states. It's not soil. It's not a fertilizer. Its best, purpose is amending soils, blending, tilling, some sort of way, working them into it to get the highest results. So some places to find these materials, again, we're going through best management practices. Sometimes the contractors and installers can do this offsite or on-site, some sort of a corporation. Where's places to purchase compost? It doesn't often get thought about, but there are direct manufacturers many people deal with, but there are also distributors like nurseries or garden centers that might resell some of this material for smaller amounts. There's firms that distribute compost as well throughout the Northeast. Companies like Naturcycle and AgriSource do some of this for project work, and there's many others out there that distribute compost, not necessarily all made by them. And then the Compost Council has an excellent map and research of its participants. Find a composter that was with BioCycle, I think now is with the Bioproducts Institute. BPI is another potential resource, but there are different sources out there. So simply saying that we don't have it locally is not always the best excuse in 2021. I'd be surprised how many different producers and types of compost are out there. And then since it's a lighter material than soil, it's something that a tractor trailer could take a longer way at a cost-effective method, and something to keep in mind when looking and sizing and planning projects. So I want to dig specifically into a compost direct use. It's called top dressing. It's common in a turf application, and this could be turf like in your front yard or on an athletic field or golf course. It might not be commonly known, but turf grass is the largest managed crop in the country. So theoretically, if we consider top grass a crop, there's more turf grass managed than anything else by far. Corn, soy, all of it. It's millions of acres when you add up all the lawns and homes and golf courses and athletic fields, and by far the largest managed crop. So thinking of the best management practices that will protect the watershed and find good compost uses throughout the Vermont, Lake Champlain Basin in New York, top dressing and compost that fit this design and this type of application, is a huge potential market. It does require the right compost though. And by the right compost, I mean the right parameters. And we'll get into that. Here pictured on the right is a top dressing machine made by a company called Turfco. You can kind of see the material coming out. We'll get into some more Vermont specific examples coming up. So just a common top dressing spec, one I wrote years ago, kind of based on something the Compost Council has, very basic. This is applying a very fine, thin, preferably dry compost over existing turf. So you're not attempting to damage the turf or blend it in. You're applying a thin layer to improve the turf in general, more like a fertilizer application. So you're applying a low amount, that quarter to a half an inch of a fairly fine compost over the entire surface of the area that you're looking to do. You aerify in some method. Aerify means punching holes or drilling holes into existing turf to help open it up. And then you're somehow smoothing and dragging out that material with a mat, or even chain link fence is an old school solution where they're dragging it to pull that material into the holes. And then suggested to water where you can at the end to help work that material in. Because compost is nutrient rich and organic rich in a lot of ways, it's also something that this would be one that tends to be a spring or fall application, even very late into the fall, almost winter, once the ground gets pretty solid. In the summer, you can burn the tops of the turf because of that organic rich material, not applying it directly. It's also because it's dark, tends to be in a dark color. So applying a dark colored compost over the field in July, it's a temporary damage, but might not look visually the best. So just something to keep in mind. So if we're going to specify top dressing with a compost, some sort of basis for the testing methodology, common ranges, you want something fairly low in soluble salts, a very stable, mature material is important, referencing back to that. And then something, fairly high in organic matter is going to get you the biggest bang for your buck. And something you can demonstrate it with screens. So there's some of those ranges and methodology there in the center. And then ways, we're going to get into specifically how this gets done now, continuing with the theme of best management practices. Sometimes it's done directly by the installer, meaning there's companies that come out and do turf applications as well, pictured on the right. It's a more ag type machine, but it's effectively applying that compost, to that athletic field for the benefit you're looking for. It's even seen it done with blower trucks and other landscape type equipment. This is where that finer compost is going to be critical. You wouldn't want to use this finer compost in most soil blends because you want a soil to be open and let in water and have more airspace. This is such a fine compost. It's most suited to this type of application. Really comes down to spreading evenly, some sort of equipment that you can calibrate. We'll show a picture, and then not over applying, that ½ inch, or so is probably about the max. And then we have seen where you can blend other things into the compost if you need to create a more holistic approach, where if you have an iron deficiency in the field, which is common with turf or other things like that, because it's a friable material, you could add other amendments. So you can do more than one thing. So some of those application rates, again, for a best management practice standpoint, how much material you'd need to do. In a common athletic field, it's a little less than an acre of material of size. Football, soccer fields, roughly an acre, give or take. So, that ½ inch, you're probably talking about 60 yards or so to do an entire a large athletic field. And there are a number of compost calculators. Green Mountain Compost has a great one that you can put in the square footage and the depth you want to apply and just calculate exactly what you might need. So timing for top dressing, I referenced it before, tend to avoid the summertime. You don't want to get out there when the soil is too wet or damp, so you compact it too much. This is a material that, although the compost could be stored on site, you probably want to get it closer to when you're going to use it to keep it drier, more ready, easily spread. And sourcing of something like this can be a little bit slower because it's a bit specialized. Maybe not every composter has the ability to make it, but there are dozens of composters that make a material, in the New York and Vermont region that would fit this spec and be available for use. So from an operation and maintenance standpoint, to really get into the nitty gritty of it, on a sand-based soil, which is common for higher end athletic fields where they're bringing in a lot of sand and making it more like what you'd call like a tee box or golf course, if you've ever been on a golf course before, or a higher end athletic field, you really should not apply compost, over apply compost. So you're alternating some compost application, maybe 1 year, sand the next, because you need to keep the ratio of sand to organic matter in a very narrow range. When you get above a certain percent of organic matter in soils, 10% or so, you can have more anaerobic conditions, more bog-like setting. That takes a lot of applications to ever get there. We're talking probably decades of over applying, because once you beat up the soil, you play sports or even use it in your own home, compaction and that use is a big enemy of soil organic matter. So that tends to go down a little bit. So if you're adding that 0.5% of organic matter every year, but you're playing 25 soccer games and 10 football games on it every year, you've easily beaten up that 0.5% and used it up just by disturbing that soil. It is a place to reduce your fertilizer application as well. If you're going to start applying compost on a regular basis, reduce the chemical fertilizers or eliminate them. I would look at the compost analysis, some of those tests we looked at before, maybe a soil test, and see if there's one particular chemical you may need. Compost is not often a great nitrogen source because of the forms of nitrogen in it, and because the compost process reduces nitrogen. That's the whole process. So, keeping that in mind for turf that sometimes needs nitrogen, that might be the one analysis you want to look at on a regular basis and just keep an eye on. So some of those tips and tricks is, the air temperature, the time of year does matter. Finding the right clean compost is important. You don't want to be spreading contaminants like plastic or glass on your athletic field. So, looking at some of that test methodology, getting that physical sample again, and ensuring it's what you want. And then I did a little project a couple years ago in the Catskills for agriculture, but it's very viable here, where they use their own manure spreader, and using a measured piece of cardboard, meaning knowing exactly its dimensions, you can calibrate how much material is being applied per acre or per square foot, based upon the mass. So you could just dump it into a bucket, get the weight, and calculate out how much you're applying. Gives you a good, I would not call it, the end-all be-all solution. There are often machines that have calibration settings and things you can do, but something like this, if you know the size of the cardboard, you can calibrate the application rate and figure out, is it coming down 1/4 inch per acre, 1/2 inch per acre, more or less, and it gives you a good, visual representation. So compost, from a cost comparison standpoint, it is a little more challenging physically to apply to a liquid than a granular fertilizer. It's not something that a couple of 50-pound bags from Home Depot will replace. You're going to have a bit more material, maybe a different specialized piece of equipment. But to keep in mind, in states like Vermont and New York, to apply those chemical fertilizers, now you need what they call a certified applicator, someone that's doing their continuing education, a trained applicator, which is an important thing from water quality and health standpoint, but that also tends to be a more expensive laborer, or what we often see in New York, schools have a tough time keeping that person on their own staff. So if this is something, compost doesn't require that type of applicator. So maybe the summertime employee or the summer help could go out at the beginning of the season in the tractor and apply these materials, once they've been trained and understand what they're doing. But it's not someone that necessarily is going to require a specific state sanctioned certification. So something to keep in mind from comparing cost, that overall the compost application might be slightly higher up front, but you get a wider variety of benefits. You get to reduce some of the other applications, and the labor differential might be something to figure in, where you might have to hire the True Green or the Chemlawns or the third party to come in, something your own staff could do when fit into the schedule. So just to give you some visual representations, what you can get just using compost, some poor lawn areas, that even a way that maybe you could utilize compost for top dressing without fancy equipment or overall solutions. Instead of bringing in topsoil to try to repair this area of lawn, you're just simply spreading some compost into the area, working it in a little bit, and reseeding. And they got a very clean, successful regrowth without importing topsoil or just throwing seed on bare ground. So again, just for the residential aspects of this, from the landscape architect, things you could write out and specify, instead of digging up this entire lawn, top dress and overseed, and they got a very healthy, successful result. And the healthier turf on the right is better at absorbing stormwater, reducing runoff. The runoff and the phosphorus potential and the nitrogen potential from the lawn on the left is far higher than the lawn on the right. So getting the lawn to look like that is actually beneficial to our waterways and lakes versus the other, when you have bare soil and negative impacts from that. So just something to keep in mind from a watershed perspective. So we're going to look quickly at a Vermont case study, Enosburg Falls High School and their athletic fields and what they applied in their costs. I mean, this is from 2006, so these dollars have changed some, but they were only spending $20, $30 a cubic yard for the material, and how much they applied, about 5 yards per 3,600 square feet. So we'll take a look at some pictures and I'll describe it. They calibrated a manure spreader to do this. Again, low-tech solution, but more green, using what they had available. So you can start to see the application. I mean, it throws the material, it gets it spread out there, then they went back through. And they were, next one. This is back to that vertiseed or aeration type step to work that material some in. You can see the pictures are in sequence. And then, they're starting to get some greener applications here. You can see some green up what it's supposed to be. Most of the material kind of disappears back into the soil and goes from there. So another aspect for direct compost use, now that we've kind of looked at how we could top dress and specify that, is the compost-based mulch. Surprisingly popular in New England. It might not be something that users are familiar with directly, but compost often gets mixed into mulch to add some darkness, that darker, richer color, especially more natural materials. You get some additional water holding benefit versus using just traditional wood mulch, and we'll see a decrease in soil erosion. So things to keep in mind is that uncomposted materials, if you're not familiar from a soil science standpoint, break down. If it's pure carbon, meaning it's all wood chip, woody, brushy material, it will break down naturally just by Mother Nature and the environment around us. And in that breakdown process, they need free nitrogen and other materials they likely take from the soil and the plants and competing for to break that carbon down. And it gets the biology kind of really active and moving. So adding some compost or using compost as a mulch reduces that pressure on the soils and around the plants. It's something that a composter, if they're making a wood-based mulch, which is not uncommon, this is something they could use their what they call overs, coarser material that might get screened out. And this compost as a mulch is pretty common already. There's a product called Sweet Peat that's a branded product that's marketed throughout the Northeast that is basically a compost sold as a mulch for different landscape applications. There's some different benefits here to look at, is that the compost might be a more sustainable approach, should reduce your fertilizer uses and other applications, higher level of turf protection. Once the materials are composted, they have a better ability to absorb water than uncomposted materials. A common ratio is like 50-50, maybe 2 to 1, sometimes mulch to compost. We'll call it mulch. Just uncomposted wood to mulch to compost. 50-50 is pretty common. A little bit lower is not uncommon either. That way you get some of the benefits of both, and kind of create like a blend. I saw the question pop up. And then using that local material, another thing to keep in mind, mulch is something these days that can travel quite far. So if you're an institution or another group looking to support more local options, specifying a composted mulch might mean a more local supplier than bringing something in from Maine or Canada, which is not uncommon in the mulch industry these days. So now that we looked at like compost use mostly related to soil and how it interacts with the soil, let's look at erosion control practices for compost and more how it protects the soil and how it can be more of a partner. So we're going to get into some erosion control, what I call more of a direct compost use versus an indirect compost use. And we'll talk on some of the best management practices there, common specs, and kind of walk you through some different applications. So why are we doing this? Many on this call are very familiar with this, but it's a good place to start when you're looking at compost and erosion control for stormwater management. If you look at the two infographics on the right, you can kind of see the natural undisturbed environment. The little arrows represent evapotranspiration and the movement of water. Most of the water in the top picture gets either infiltrated, into the ground, or evaporates because the plants are using it in some form, mostly through photosynthesis. So you're getting 80-90% of the water never leaves that area. What happens in our more built up and disturbed environments, be it suburban or a farm or a heavily urban environment, you can see in that bottom graphic, most of the water, 50, 60, 70% runs off. So what we're trying to do with erosion control practices using compost is better recreate that first slide or picture on the top right versus what we have to deal with in the bottom there. So we're trying to mimic nature, find more ways to focus on infiltration. How do we, transpirate this water in place using plants, a higher level of stormwater management. And compost is a critical best management practice and tool that we're going to expand on now. So Vermont stormwater and permits do require a number of different erosion prevention and sediment control techniques. Compost is an important part of that, be it a blanket or berm, or we're going to expand on this, but I'm just laying the Vermont groundwork. And then there are post-construction soil quality requirements important too that relate back to that soil fill and amending, that the soil has to have a certain amount of organic matter content, and that's what the compost can provide when mixed with it. And then even permits for general road construction, some sort of stabilization and reduce potential runoff. The runoff in these scenarios often comes from the physical particle. So how does the compost hold it in place, catch it if it's moving, etc. So we're going to get into some more details here. So road construction and remediation, if these are not terms you're familiar with, if you're building a road or a highway, or even a really maybe even a private driveway access, you're cutting through banks and areas of soil. How do you stabilize that now exposed soil or subsoil? Compost can improve the vegetation. The vegetation is what's going to hold these things together long term, and compost is an important tool for that. Something like a blanket or a berm, which we'll get into a bit more. And VTrans has demonstrated these materials before. States like California and Texas don't have a lot in common in 2021 these days, but they both use millions of cubic yards of compost for erosion control applications like compost blankets. It's their preferred method to stabilize hillsides and roadside vegetation. So these are, again, those direct erosion control practices. There's three critical uses of compost therein: the erosion control blankets, the compost berm techniques, and filter socks. These compost here, we'll get into the spec, is something much coarser, more mulch looking like. You can see on the right, he's applying a coarse material. It's a little hard to see visually at this distance, but to repair that area, you can kind of see some washout at the bottom. There's compost blankets really made up of two parts. There's a blanket and a berm, or a blanket and a sock combination, which we're going to expand on a bit here. That's a compost sock. If you're not familiar with one, going in more in a ditch check application, but you can kind of see what they look like. The combination of these techniques is what leads to success. It could be something for a stream bank restoration, or a stockpile protection on a site. And there's some DOT and commercial applications that we're going to get into. And there's a number of ways this could get utilized more in the state of Vermont. So pictured in the bottom right is what I'm talking about with that coarser compost. It's got a larger wood fraction often. That allows, when rainfall hits it, to be broken up and slow down, versus a very fine compost, which is very good at absorbing water, but it also is such a thing as too good. If it sucks up too much water, it can slough or slide because it absorbs so much water. So you want some combination of the coarse and fine material to get the best results from a water management standpoint. So the berms and socks, can be used in pollutant removal. Blankets, break up stormwater and can reduce pollution runoff. There's a couple of different, that back to AASHTO specifications we're going to look at, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. They're used throughout the country. It's that coarser material, what they often call the middles if you're screening, with the majority of it, not being too fine, bigger than a 1/4 inch. So if you have never seen a compost blanket and berm combination, this is a good visual from AASHTO, demonstrating how it kind of looks and works. The blanket goes in the middle to protect the slope, and the berms go at the end, or a sock, to protect water from running underneath it. So this is the actual AASHTO spec that's available for use and publicly out there from the state highway transportation officials. They have a vegetated version and a non-vegetated version. I don't really see the non-vegetated or unvegetated version that often. It's mostly the vegetated method. They test for a variety of different things like we talked about before. They look at the moisture content of the compost so it could get spread and applied. The particle sizing is very detailed here compared to some other specs. And then they also look for inerts, plastic, glass, things you don't want in there. They have a method for that we can test with to ensure we're not spreading that on hillsides or roads. And then the key thing to take away from an actual erosion blanket specification, if you're a landscape architect or a highway transportation official, is there is something called the erosivity index that you can go on the EPA website. We're going to look at in the slide coming up. And it'll tell you what type of slope application you need to do, how much compost you should apply. Again, you don't want to over apply to cause potential sloughing, falling away issues, and you don't want to under apply so you could have runoff. So there's a real fine line here of how much compost you should apply based upon how much rain that area might get. So the continued spec here, it's a very long spec because it's based upon for highway construction, so it's very detailed. It's that the compost really needs to envelop the hillside. If you don't have the access to those socks or berms to protect that slope, you're really not just putting it on the face of the slope. You're trying to go up and over the top and at the bottom, so water isn't getting underneath or penetrating that blanket. You really want to create a blanket and envelop the hillside. So if you're going to spec a compost erosion control blanket, you're going to need to go look up that rainfall erosivity index is the term. You can go onto the EPA's website, pictured right there on the left. You put in the exact address and it will literally tell you the number that you need to go back and look in the spec and how much compost you should apply. This is Bennington, Vermont. It's my in-laws' house, if anyone wants to go there. My mother-in-law's a great cook. Tell her I sent you. The rainfall for them is about 5.39, kind of small to see. But you can literally plug in the address. So it's very simple to use. It'll tell you, how much rain you expect in the area. The time, you need to know the roughly start time of the project, end time of the project for it to calculate it out properly. But, very available and right out there. So now that we kind of got an idea of the spec, let's look at how they really get used in the real world, the best management practices. A slope, an uncomposted slope, we'll call in this example, the water tends to roll downhill. It builds up speed as it moves further. You get rills and washout areas, channels develop, you get all kinds of erosion. When you've applied a compost product, even versus some of the artificial products like mats or things like that, the compost has what they call 100% soil contact. I mean, because you're applying it in some method, the compost is always touching the soil. It might not be like one of those artificial jute mats that at the end of the day is a two-dimensional object going over a three-dimensional hillside. So to get it to truly make contact, it is not as easy as it might sound because it's never perfectly flat or smooth, where the compost, if applied with a blower truck or a slinger or even bulldozed with the right equipment over the edge of the slope, you're getting 100% soil contact. So water's not going to get in there. Water's not going to get behind it. It really knits the slope together. And it's porous enough to allow some water to infiltrate and to slow it down, which again is really what you're looking for. You don't want a sheet of plastic where all the runners running off. You want the small rainfall events to be absorbed and stay in place and the bigger ones to be broken up. So how to install a compost blanket. I've kind of referenced this, but these are some different common ways to do it. The spread in a variety of different methods. So it could be if you haven't seen a slinger truck or a blower truck. These are lightweight applications where they're trying to do something on the hillside that isn't going to disturb it. This is a blower application pictured, and then you can hydroseed over it. It applies a bit more like a mulch than you would think in a lot of compost. So ways to keep in mind, I mean, any low impact application is going to be critical. That's what protects the hillside and gets the compost functioning in the best way. So here's some different pictures. These are different slinger applications. This is like a new fancy slinger walk behind unit somebody's developed that you can feed and it'll throw the material onto the hillside and you just walk it with a remote. The other one is a blower truck application down in the south someplace where you kind of see that they're applying this material up and over the edge like I talked about and right down the hillside. And that's a fairly steep like 2-to-1 slope. So berms are an important part of that, again, to kind of envelop the entire hillside. Here's an example of a berm application instead of silt fence in Windham, in the Brattleboro, Vermont area, if you're not familiar, where they used it as their stormwater mitigation on site. So the compost filter berm is often paired with the compost blanket application. It sometimes is used by itself as a silt fence alternative as well. But this is what that spec looks like and what the berm's going to need to do. They tie together, so it's kind of no point going into too much detail on just the one. But here's what the superiority and why there's some potential, major benefits here is that the compost acts as a 3-dimensional filter versus 2-dimensional applications. So in this berm example, you can kind of see that when water hits the berm or interacts with it, it's moving through this media versus just simply hitting a dam. Sediment builds up a little bit behind it over time, but it's still functional because it moves up through the 3-dimensional shape versus the next slide, which here's what those berms look like in PA as an alternative. Just next one. Some berm cost examples based on a previous US EPA program. The all-in cost, it was about $7 to $8 a linear foot. Material cost was a few dollars a linear foot. Again, these are 2006 dollars. The filter sock, though, functions as the next level of a berm technique, where you're encasing that berm for a more permanent solution, let's call it. You're putting that coarse mulch-like material into a 3-dimensional filter to kind of hold it in place. Again, back to that visual representation, if you haven't seen it, what's going to function and happen in a sock versus a silt fence. So here's those socks functioning, some pictures I took in PA a few years ago. You can kind of see that, unlike a silt fence, it's not purely a damming technique and how clean the soils are around them on the other side. The compost filter sock, again, this is that combination with the blanket. If you're going to apply a blanket, you need to have some way to make sure the water is not penetrating behind it. The picture on the right is actually an install in Vermont from V-Trans, where they're using it on a more steep slope to kind of break up any potential water and runoff. Here's a picture from UVM. These socks are often sold in a palletized or other manner, so they can bring them in early to a site and place them out if they're going to be disturbing soils. And some different ways to source that potentially. What's interesting here is as this market has grown, you can buy the sock palletized, meaning someone's already filled them up and put them on a pallet. So if you're ordering pipe or other stormwater supplies, they can bring the socks to you. As part of the other order. You can kind of see below on the bottom right there that there are different distributors and installers of sock as well, that they're using a fin blower truck, which is very common in the mulch world, a lower cost piece of equipment that you can install sock with on a construction site or in a road construction application. Different ways to get these materials sourced and available. Different distributors like EJ Prescott is very big in the, just as an example, not an endorsement, in the stormwater equipment world for pipe and different filters. They distribute a palletized sock product. So what I want to delve into a little bit more is the silt fence versus sock discussion. You can kind of see an example of a failure on a right. The silt fence is intended to act as a dam, which is its goal and what it's supposed to do. But often in some scenarios, the dam solution might not be the best for true stormwater management and what you're looking to do in many applications. They're very common, but they're often not installed properly. The silt fence, there's a strong technique and method to how they get installed. They need to be buried below the soil grade. They need to be staked out properly to prevent issues like this. And they have a real finite timeline because of their materials they're made out of and how much sediment they can truly hold. So just some other examples of that type of failure, because of their application and how much sediment they can really manage, some more visual representations today. Here's one of those slides I've been trying to allude to earlier, that, a silt fence is a 2-dimensional, like solid dam wall, which is, again, its purpose and what it, is designed to do. But that means as pressure is applied, you can get some geometric issues developing because as the bottom builds up silt, it doesn't really handle extra pressure on the top well, where we showed earlier in those 3-dimensional sock and berm applications, the water tends to flow through because of gravity. It's not going to shoot across the top of the berm. It's going to, by gravity, come back down through the material. So you get a different benefit using a 3-dimensional filter, sock, or berm versus a 2-dimensional silt fence. So again, here's that point of failure. If it's installed properly, this might not be as common, but that's a large if it's installed properly, where you get the failure as the sediment builds up in the bottom. So some of these filter stock costs and price differentials, the filter stock tends to have a higher upfront cost, but maybe a lower overall all-in cost, in part because the berm applications might not need to be removed. They could just be spread out once they've completed their job and vegetated over. Some filter stock products are even biodegradable, so they can remain in place and be spread out later. There's a lot of different ways these things get installed and managed, but with the cost of oil and materials in a silt fence, there's a strong correlation between them being similarly priced installations, especially on larger applications like a DOT or a large new construction site. A lot of commercial construction firms throughout the country that we've seen present over the years and I've heard talk, major home builders and stuff have gone to these type of applications instead of more traditional silt fence because their greatest success, the likelihood of them coming back less. Companies like Toll Brothers, which is a huge home builder, if you haven't heard of them, throughout the country, really have actually endorsed these products for proprietary providers out there because it benefited them so much versus traditional silt fence. So just something to keep in mind and look at when specifying and designing these things. Another one, this is probably one where timing is really going to be most important, that this is a design application benefit. It's something that gets built into your stormwater management, your SWIP up front. It's not something that gets changed often at the end. It's something that's designed by the landscape architect or engineer up front. There are erosion control businesses. It's a good place to start. There are firms that just specialize in installing erosion control and erosion control products. So it's a place to start if you're an institution or a municipality looking for these type of solutions. You'd be surprised how many firms have decided to specialize just in erosion control. And sometimes they're even tied to composters. In the Midwest, there's a number of large composters that do the erosion control as part of their business. So someplace we see growth in compost and compost use. So some tips and tricks here, like we've done with all our best management practices today. The physical sample is probably a good place to start to make sure they're getting you that coarse material, especially if you're doing a blanket or berm. Hydroseeding over these materials is not a terrible solution. You get, potentially better grass growth and turf establishment because you're providing a bit better media for it to grow on. Things to keep in mind. And then location of compost availability really drives a lot of this cost. In places like Burlington, where you might have a number of different composters, these type of applications might be more viable than Montpelier in the middle of the state. Just an example of what might be available in the market drives the cost. So I wouldn't write it off day one. I would at least evaluate my site and what you've got going on to look at if a berm or blanket application might be a better, slope solution. So some of the other benefits, just to put it out there from a filter standpoint, is that a filter sock offers a more natural solution in a way because you're trying to trap and slow the sediment versus just let it build up in one spot. It should reduce the opportunities for you to come to the site and have to fix other washouts. It can trap a variety of soil particulates and particular chemicals, potentially even hydrocarbons, things like that, and it can be left on site and spread out after. So again, a potentially more natural solution.
Great, and let's just go ahead. One question came in, so let's just see. So for a comment, even with two-dimensional erosion control, you're mitigating the erosive impact of the rainfall, which is valuable. So the difference, I guess, between a silt fence and a sock. And I think something is better than nothing. Jump in here if you want to add to it, Chuck.
But they're definitely, the more traditional jute mats or artificial solutions definitely have benefits. I'm just trying to point out one of the potential upsides to a blanket application versus the artificial applications. And again, every project's going to be slightly different. It might not be the best fit. I'm not a big believer in one size fits all. But there are some significant benefits to a compost blanket versus the traditional methods.
Great. Oh, sorry, I stopped before the detailed research.
Oh yeah, if you really want to delve into this issue, there's a couple things I would definitely take a look at. Caltrans has produced an entire series on this, even with Q&A from a variety of different experts. it's a very long video, but if you're in the DOT or in an engineering firm and specifying this stuff, they've got a 3.5-hour webinar. That's very long, but it's very interesting. And then, there's different research and things like that I participated in with Corey Poland out of Wisconsin that compared these erosion control techniques throughout the country and their efficacy. So, just something to keep in mind. There are very detailed resources available. IECA, that International Erosion Control Association, has a ton of stuff too to take a look at. So now that we've kind of talked about direct compost use and erosion control, let's circle back to a low nutrient, more indirect applications. Definitely something very important from the Lake Champlain Basin standpoint. How do we ensure compost is not a negative nutrient source, having runoff issues with phosphorus or nitrogen? And there are techniques and methods available and commonly used that we can get into here today and discuss more commonly. Like some direct compost uses in water might mean you're making a soil blend with it, or using it on a river or hillside directly for stabilization. There are specs and methods we're going to get into that you can write up and plan for and test for independently that can verify you're not going to be contributing to nutrient runoff, which is important. Let's get into that. So this is how we can get into those applications around water bodies. To me, it really comes down to analysis. There are a number of method things you could look at, and let's call them process. But from my standpoint and from a scientific standpoint, I would say the method, the analysis and independent analysis by lab is probably the better long-term solution than purely process description. So we're going to get into some of that analysis and methodology here. So one of the common nutrients of concern, especially in the Northeast, is phosphorus, where phosphorus runoff and phosphorus loading. Vermont has some methods they've designed around the saturated media extract, which is a soil test method or a media test method that gets media as anything that's not soil, but gets used as soil for our discussion today, where they're trying to extract water extractable phosphorus from the material to determine how much is potentially there. Penn State has a method that is becoming more common in my world, in the Compost Council's world, and in a few different consultants I deal with, for water extractable P that was developed around manures, which are of big concerns to many environmental agencies throughout the country. It's very well tested. It's very reliable method and works on all kinds of different carbon-based materials. So Penn State has a method for water extractable P that we're going to talk a little bit about here. So this is just one spec potentially if you're going to design a bioretention basin or maybe even a compost blanket. You could borrow part of this. You could work these numbers and methods into a spec to ensure you're not going to have nutrient runoff potential with that compost. I know it is a major concern and has been throughout the region, but there are ways to design the specification and then test the compost independently to ensure you won't be contributing those negative things. So this spec looks a little bit more at some of the nutrients and some of the others we've shown, talks about N and P. We'll get into it some more. To me, there's two key things. If you're going to have reduced runoff potential for negative effects, from a nutrient standpoint, you need to have a very mature, stable compost. The more that process is finished, the less water available nutrients that should be in there in general. So we want to show a very stable, mature compost. That's important, just as a starting point with that top circle. The next one is that, Penn State actually has a water extractable phosphorus method that we can do based upon a PPM and independently verify that there isn't any phosphorus going to be leaching from this compost. This spec, we started out at like 800 ppm for the compost overall. Compost has to have some nutrient for that plant to succeed and for that soil to be improved. There should be some level of nutrient there. It's kind of a question of how much is useful and how much is available. So we started out at 800 ppm. That number could be brought down relative to the compost type and application. We just did a test on a couple of materials for a project in New York, and it was as low as 100 ppm in a more, carbonine compost material. So that's the method at the bottom. It's fairly detailed, long, standard, but that's what you're going to be looking for if you want this test done. It's a fairly inexpensive test too. It's like $25. It's not some crazy complex thing, but it's a way to evaluate it. So this is where that compost gets used in the bioinfiltration. You usually got inert materials like sand and stone in the Vermont specs mixed with a small percent compost to make a viable plant health area, health profile. And then you also have something that can help hold some of that water. But it's a fine line between applying too much compost and having runoff potential and applying too little that the plants don't succeed or don't take off. And then you have bare soils and a failed system. So there is some kind of healthy medium, Naturcycle believes we should be exploring. So how do we install these, low nutrient application compost uses? It's that bioretention soil or a wetland mix. This is an important place, again, where they're incorporated really well. What's the basis of your design and limiting your application rates that they can't apply too much compost? Something you'd have to determine by testing or writing the spec that way. How do you apply around water sensitive areas, be it a stream bank restoration, et cetera? Do you apply a little lighter than you would in other applications? And then doing some sort of testing and verification on a recent and maybe in particular batch of compost to ensure what you want. We've seen on some environmental projects where they will set aside material to ensure it's the right material going to the job. It's not just the next batch that comes available. So how do we source these things? There are low nutrient composts available and people that test for this on a regular basis. Just from a purely product and right compost standpoint, this might be the place where manure-based compost is not the best fit, but just something to keep in mind. Compost with larger amount of wood or carbon might be a bit better fit here. In an unstable or poorly composted material is definitely not the most suitable for any type of low nutrient or water contact application. Timing, this is something that could take a little bit longer, more planning up front, maybe in the design phase versus the change later type application. Very wet conditions are probably not a good time to be working around water bodies and soils anyways. The goal is to reduce soil disturbance. We often see in New England, sometimes they'll even install the bioretention soils if possible in the winter conditions so that the basin itself is frozen and they're applying the soil on top of it to reduce impact. Back to those soil throwers or slingers. There's different ways to time out the application to protect the watershed as part of the design. So operations and maintenance best management practices, things to keep in mind. In my opinion, and I would say most of the research tends to bail out that the no organic matter or zero organic matter basin design could have has long-term performance issues. Yes, sometimes nutrients and things accumulate in these basins, but plants need something to get started. Even a low level of organic matter is at least going to give the plant a place to start, get the biology rolling. New Jersey has 100% sand-based application they use sometimes that does not seem to have a lot of success because it's just literally nothing but coarse and fine sand mixed together as an attempt to retain water. If that's the goal, fine. But if you're going to do a more traditional bioretention or infiltration basin that has plants, organic matter is going to be critical at some level. Future in-place testing is important and things like those lines. Cost comparisons for our conversation today of best management practices. Sometimes I see peat moss specified as an alternative to compost. Peat moss has very little nutrients, but a lot of organic matter. So sometimes it does get specified, but it's not renewable and it tends to be very expensive in our region. It really only comes out of Canada. It's a little expensive option here potentially. And then there are chemical and mechanical systems for removing phosphorus potentially on these sites or protecting them, like they call it the storm filter. It's like a cartridge for your fish tank or whatever, but on a massive scale. And those can be very expensive and need to be replaced on a regular basis where a well-made bioretention system could perform the same function, but maybe at a lower cost. So just as an example, some things we've seen over the years in Pennsylvania is an example that this was a sandy material to begin with, but had almost no organic matter. They added a small amount of compost and rototilled it in, fairly low application rate. This isn't going to work well for every application, but in this large commercial construction setting, they were able to improve the soil in place as part of their design. Just something to keep in mind for maybe a large school or institution or a new building. This is a way you could achieve a viable bioretention basin without, importing so much soil. So some tips and tricks, again, back to that manure compost, maybe if it's part of the blend, it'd be unlikely because of the types of nutrients available in manure and the nature of manure itself. But if it's a low percentage of the blend, it could often fit well here. Something with woody, more carbonous material. Penn State and U of Maine offer some nutrient testing that might be viable for this. Larger compost businesses might be more versed in these techniques. Something to keep in mind, like Green Mountain Compost or AgriSource that we're familiar with, have a bit more technical knowledge, not to put down a smaller composter, but if we want to ensure the results, a more technical composter might be called for, maybe Vermont Composting, someone that has a bit more scale that would be familiar with some of these complex analysis.
All right. And so before we move on to agriculture applications, thanks so much, Chuck. Question, where do food scraps-based compost fit into the low nutrient compost applications? So you talked about manure, Chuck. How would you classify some of the food?
Food could have some similar challenges depending upon the food types and materials. A lot of our food is fairly nitrogen rich, so it just kind of depends on your blend and your mix, and what they're doing with it. And the types of food. I'm sure some foods are have a less long-term nutrient potential than others. But if it's well made, stabilized, starting with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, a lot of materials could meet these type of standards without a problem. It really comes down to a good process, the right carbon to nitrogen balance, and then doing the testing and analysis to verify it's met what you're looking for. So there's definitely a place for food scraps. I'd have to know more about that particular compost and their mix and recipe. But you could mend it if this was something a composter was looking to do. Often they could maybe make a batch for low nutrient applications that most of your compost is food scrap. This one we put 25% less food scraps in, and it meets the standard we're looking for, and we can use it or market it in that way, a lower nutrient application, just as a thought.
Thank you so much, Chuck, for carrying the first sections, and we're going to switch to Brian now, who's going to talk to us about agricultural applications.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Chuck. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So this next section is focused on agricultural applications. A number of the watersheds in the Lake Champlain Basin have a higher percentage of agricultural lands, both in Vermont and New York, as compared to some of the more developed watersheds closer to Burlington. So there are a number of best management practices related to compost that can have a significant impact. So in closing the loop, you think about that in terms of you growing the food on the fields, composting it, and then returning this organic matter back to the crop soils. The specifications don't have as much detail as Chuck has illustrated in the various landscape and top dressing criteria. But the things that are going to be more of concern are related to pathogens, heavy metals, and things that could go into the food chain. Looking at particular details of the compost, the characteristics of particle size. If you're using it in a greenhouse or potting mix setting, you're going to want finer particles that can be blended in with other soil amendments to try to get the good rooting and starting mix for good germination, whereas coarser materials can be good for more broadcast on fields and have more of that erosion control effect of covering and protecting bare soil. But ultimately what we're trying to do is improve soil quality. Also can look at healthy soil as that same term. And in a lot of the cases by building up that improving the biology and physical structure through compost additions, you're making the soil looser where the roots can penetrate and water and air can both move more readily through the soil profile. There's other impacts that people talk about related to cation exchange capacity, and that helps hold on to nutrients and minerals and release them when the roots and the plants are trying to take them up. And then, like a lot of ecosystems, the more diverse they are, the more resistant they are to pests and have that natural biological resistance. This slide I thought is important because there's different pore sizes, micropores, mesopores, macropores, small, medium, and large. The large pores are the things you can physically see. So wormholes, everything up to woodchuck burrows, old root channels. So those are where water will freely drain through the soil profile. The small pores are the things that are so small that we can't see. And if you remember science class, that capillary movement where moisture is literally against the side of soil particles and can slowly creep up even against gravity through the soil. In terms of soil quality, it's those intermediate pores or mesopores that are most important. They're where water can be held in the soil. It can both drain in and be held for those times of drought, and the roots are typically able to penetrate in there. So when they've done tests on soils after organic matter has been applied or other good soil management practices, that percentage of intermediate or mesopores increases. And that crumb structure of the soil or how the soil particles aggregate is improved and results in improved soil functions. So what we often see is a lot of aggressive mechanical tools are used to prepare a very smooth and even seed bed. But as a result, you can often destroy a lot of the biology and soil structure that existed. And then once you get a rainfall event on that bare exposed soil, it can be very much further crust over and seal the soil surface, losing its ability to infiltrate. And this is a good illustration of that, and I think very relevant to the issues of Lake Champlain. So we have all this open land, and when it has well-functioning, healthy soil, you'll see that infiltration where a rainfall event hits the vegetation on the surface. It's slowly working its way through the soil profile and being stored. Whereas if that soil crusts over or smears after those raindrops damage the soil surface, then the soil tends to act more like a parking lot. And even though it has all this potential to hold on to moisture, it's shedding it and not only moving that water for higher peak flows, but it's carrying the soil, the nutrients and other pollutants and sediment into our streams, rivers, and the lake. And then to take that further, the soil moisture benefits are significant. If you're able to get the moisture into the soil through protecting the surface and getting that infiltration, once you increase organic matter through additions of compost and other good soil management practices, there's that huge sponge effect. So each additional 1% of organic matter, I'll read this right out, can increase the water holding capacity by 16,000 gallons of water per acre. So if, as we mentioned before, 2 to 3% is fairly common in agricultural soils. If we're able to increase that to 4 or 5% through reduced tillage, additions of organic matter like compost, we're going to have much more moisture retained in the landscape. And some of what we've seen with these larger rainstorm events, more of that moisture can be retained up in our watersheds instead of rapidly going downstream, not only causing that loss of nutrients and sediment at the field level, but those higher peak flows also scour channels and cause additional erosion from the stream and river beds and river banks, and ultimately deposit all that material and phosphorus into the lake. So there's a big impact that could be realized by improving the soil organic matter. The additional benefits with our changing climate is while we often see these large intense storms, we're also seeing greater periods of drought, sometimes weeks in the summer where we can have little or no rainfall in parts of the Champlain Basin. And with those mesopores that we talked about before, they're able to hold on to that water where roots can still access it. that moisture for plant growth through those periods. So ultimately, it can have a big impact on the needs for irrigation. Setting up irrigation systems are quite expensive, and also continuing to operate them. So significant impacts can be made if this was adopted on a more widespread basis. Looking at the specs, the vigor, this would be probably most important again for potting mixes where you're starting plants. So when plants are most fragile at their germination and early stage, you're going to want to have that maturity so that you don't have some of those byproducts that might be phytotoxic or harmful to plant growth. And then again, if you're trying to mix it and put it in small seedling flats or other containers, the particle size is going to be very important for that application. A little less important if you're applying it to a hay or a cornfield and on a larger basis, larger scale. Similar to the logistics of getting us to a site, if you're a greenhouse operator, getting the material rather than in 60 bag pallet, you could get a super sack and be able to get your grow mix out of there. Side dressing is one way to minimize your costs. So rather than broadcasting everywhere on a field or in a nursery, you can band it or side dress it right in the root zone adjacent to the plant or the crop, where it's going to have the most impact and benefit to the root zone. And then in terms of the source of the feedstocks, a wide range of inputs are appropriate, except if you were going to be putting it in a riparian or near stream area. This is where the fertility is going to be more able to be used by the plants. Lots of crops have significant phosphorus and nitrogen demands, so manure-based composts are certainly going to be more appropriate in many agricultural applications. This next couple slides are related to a demonstration of compost applications in the Catskills, part of the watershed that drains to New York City. Got a bare field here. You can see no cover crop of field, just the corn stubble, typically often seen after growing corn silage. One of the different application options, this is a truck carrying compost from one of the facilities in Delaware County, New York. So you could do this with regular spreaders that you're more familiar with, but also by trucks if the soils on the field are sufficiently dry and can support the weight. Just a comment on the dust, certainly makes it lighter to transport and you can put a bigger load. But if this was done on a windy day, you'd have the risk of wind erosion and losing some of that organic matter and the nutrients associated with that into nearby waterways. So just being aware of not only the soil conditions, but the weather conditions related to the material that you're going to apply. In terms of nursery here, you can see there's kind of a gravelly or cobbly soil. So lots of little stones around the trees. So having some compost to break up the dense soils here is going to help that retain more moisture and result in better establishment and growth for these plants and trees. Now, looking at specific edge of field or other runoff control and erosion control applications, certainly agricultural fields are a source of nutrients, not only because of the erosion, but you're actively applying manure, fertilizer, and other fertility to help the crops grow. So some of the runoff from these fields can even have a higher impact on our waterways. So compost filter socks, similar to how they're used in those developed settings, can be really helpful in agricultural settings as well. The top one is in construction process, but allows you to see the profile of 3 compost filter socks piled on top of each other. So if a large flow of water, it's going to be able to have a higher depth of of liquid that it can retain, and then slowly filter through before the water's released on the other side. Check dams are almost creating step pools. So in a ditch or a swale setting, you can have them spaced as the slope steps down. It allows the moisture or the water in that flow to slow down. And with various soil particles, as the speed of the water slows down, it allows more of the sediment and particles to settle and not continue to stay suspended and carry them downstream to the receiving water. And then ultimately the seeded filter socks and other BMPs are a way to establish vegetation, again, more roughness that slows the water down, and then ultimately more uptake. So how are you going to get these materials? Since there's a little more tolerance for a variety of materials in terms of their particle size and nutrient levels, there's more options on finding sources. So probably the biggest factor is going to be the cost and finding local facilities. There's a number of farms that make compost in New York and Vermont. This one in Lyndonville, technically outside of the Champlain Basin, but they have an aerated system here where they mix manure with local food scraps that they accept from schools and other businesses, wood chips. Much of the material is used then on the farm. This is an organic dairy, so the majority of the compost that they produce are put back on their own fields. But you can oftentimes find lists of these. Some of these sites are going to be certified or registered in New York or Vermont through the state. Others are going to be more word of mouth, and you'll be able to find out through them through NOFA Vermont or just word of mouth in your community. Just a quick slide showing how the food scraps are delivered. Black Dirt Farm is one of the haulers that brings food scraps both to their own farm, but also to Tamerlane. So again, here's your source of fertility. Instead of putting all these nutrients into a landfill, they're being returned to our soils in Tamerlane farms in particular. So that's where we can have that impact on closing the loop. So cost comparisons. It's kind of framing the cost comparison here as the discussion. So if you're purely looking at the agronomic or nutrient demands of different crops, what you can obtain in commercial fertilizers for that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium may be difficult to beat on a one-to-one basis versus compost. So as Chuck mentioned earlier, the biggest thing is the compost is a soil amendment. So that's, in addition to the nutrients, it's really going to provide that improvement in organic matter and all the follow-on impacts of bringing in some additional biology, the moisture holding capacity, and building carbon in the soil. So you get those multiple impacts of soil improvement. And this is validated by a number of yield trials over the years. You can considerably reduce or eliminate the amount of fertilizer needed to get an equal or greater yield of crops when you're also using some amount of compost. So it does have a significant impact on not only crop yields, but then all of what we've discussed related to improving soil and water quality. So compost, putting on so all these soil conditions, we're still going to see some of these concentrated flows. So compost alone isn't the only solution to all of this. Don't want to oversell what we're able to do. Ultimately, you're going to need a range of practices. Some of this issue could be caused by upslope drainage. There could have been ruts in the field that concentrated the flow and then directed this. There could be other issues of soil quality being degraded over time through excessive tillage or use of commercial fertilizer. So all these other practices like cover cropping, rotating the crops in the field cycle, in addition to improving organic matter through use of compost, are going to be a package. So each field is different, and there's going to be unique hydrology of each field. So beyond this as general advice, you can always approach your local soil and water or natural resource conservation district and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service and the various Department of Ag or Agency of Ag technical support services for more specific assistance. And this is, again, framing it, a lot of this is been known for some time, but I think what we were trying to communicate with this series is the urgency for this. We've got a lot of work to do with Lake Champlain to meet the targets set down through the Environmental Protection Agency in the state of Vermont, states of New York, to improve it. But it's not just meeting a number of numbers, it's preserving a resource that's been impacted by algae blooms and other degradation that impacts our ability to enjoy it ourselves for recreation and as a water supply, and has an impact on our tourism economy and so forth. And then also, when we're looking at these things, there's a number of regulations and rules, both in stormwater and developed landscape and agriculture, that have been developed to try to work towards this. But we're trying to encourage people to go past just that, trying to barely meet compliance, but really say, what can we do extra to have more of, how are we going to restore our landscape to be able to go further in improving water quality and regenerate it, because our climate is changing. We're having an increasing number of these larger storms of an inch or greater of rainfall that our current landscape and set of practices is not often well set up to handle. So we're going to have to go these extra steps. We can't do things the way we've always done them if we're going to ultimately see success in these watershed protection efforts.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. So one question did come in, Brian, while you were talking. Let's see. Is there a list of Vermont contractors or suppliers who can blend composts to create soil specifications required by the state for bioretention systems?
Well, hi, Hisa. Hope you're doing well. No, I don't think there is, and that there really should be. I mean, Chuck may even know better. He's got a great depth of knowledge throughout the entire Northeast of who's making what where. The state has a list of certified facilities. So, over in your area, you've got Eric Paris and Black Dirt Farm. But in terms of making these very specific formulations to meet what contractors or landscape architects are making, I think that's what we've in part identified as a gap that could need some further development. So making sure that both the producers of the compost can manufacture blends to meet those specs, but then even the landscape architects or engineers to interpret them and even know what they're asking to receive. And Chuck, you can probably add to that. You've been more involved.
Yeah, that's where I've tried to pull some familiarity from. Is we deal with AgriSource out of New England fairly regularly, and they seem to have some knowledge about what's going on. I've talked to Kevin from DEP in the past a few times about potential spec changes and things over time. Without a standardized set of compost testing, to start with, even the best soil specs are hard to work with, because I can't compare apples to apples from one compost producer down the road from the other to then build that into a soil spec and to know what might be the best use or what application rate might be viable. It is, a challenge. So, I mean, it's almost easier to start with the compost because they have so many more uses and then build into the soil, because there's a number of different things. The soils are often built around inerts like washed concrete sand or the stony, what's the aggregate blend they like. Those are very standard ASTMs that 1 million producers can reach. And then it's the compost that seems to be the organic amendment that's the challenging piece, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'll just add that two things. One, I did just last week speak with Kevin Burke at Vermont DEC Stormwater, and they are cycling back and looking at their bioretention spec again, and they're actively going to be adding guidance around that, because there are a lot of issues, not only with sourcing, but with just understanding the testing, the differences between total nutrient analysis or water available nutrient analysis, all of those things. So they are working that back in, and he just wanted me to share that there will be another cycle of guidance coming from them. And then I'll also just add that we're moving from this broader sort of best management practice overview webinar where we touched on a lot of the different types of applications. We're going to be doing deep dives into specific like one on just agricultural stuff and getting more into that, or one for, erosion control or road projects. And one of the things that we're trying to assess now, if there's enough interest in, is actually doing one specifically for compost facilities, facility managers, and and the different organizations that might be doing some of those blending, to sort of bring them along and update them and sensitize them to what other specs are being used, what are the perceived needs. So hopefully we're working towards filling some of that. We had another question about what would be the best way to get farmers to handle their manure in better ways or more sustainable ways.
Well, I'll start by paying them more for their milk so that they actually have some money. But I think that there's probably 7 answers to this, but some of it is based on their continued rollout of the relatively new required agricultural practices, and then the permits that they have for medium and large farms in Vermont. So a lot of those do encourage better practices in terms of setbacks and application rates and so forth. It's definitely more of the organic community that seems to be interested in the compost production because seems to be more awareness of the soil quality benefits of compost applications. And so I think it's a combination of both financial incentives through the existing state and federal programs, but also ongoing technical assistance. So workshops like this, but then while they've been limited this year, Extension and NOFA and other organizations have annual conferences. So just trying to encourage different workshops to get out there that show examples of how people have already done it, where the pitfalls are, and often, in addition to money, the other shortage that farmers have is time. So finding out systems that are realistic to manage with all the other responsibilities of operating a farm are the ones that are more likely to be carried out and stay in place.
Chuck, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, it's the compost standards are really the question for a state like Vermont. Is how do you, if you don't have a common basis of design with that, it's tough to build some of the other pieces, not to tout one program or another, but what the Composting Council has done with STA and the methodology that you can use nationwide, it's really shown a lot of growth. California and Texas, hundreds of participants now in these type of programs because of, a common standard. Obviously Vermont's a smaller state, but common standards really, allow growth in industries for commercial uses like this.
Mm-hmm. And I'll also just add, Athena, there's a lot of really interesting conversations happening in Vermont right now around payment for ecosystem services. And I haven't had the time to track all of them, but that might be something that you want to look into. And it gets a little bit to what Brian was talking about in terms of really recognizing and valuing in some way all of the ecosystem services that farmers and agriculture can provide our state and states. So not just Vermont, but New York and Quebec as well, in terms of the healthy soil, the water holding capacity, the infiltration, better vegetation, really connecting and increasing understanding around everything that this workshop is about, which is tying those soil health principles with water quality as well. And so I think that The thing is that we do a lot of talking as well, and a lot of these conversations have been going on forever. So how do we really move that needle collectively? And I think all of us just getting more engaged and following some of the conversations that are happening in the State House is one way to sort of increase the volume of the urgency for these practices. Thank you so much, Chuck and Brian and everybody involved in the Soil Builders program. This is a great webinar and I think really sets the stage well for some of these deeper dives. I'd meant to add a slide about the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit that's coming up. We're holding it this year in conjunction with International Compost Awareness Week, which is the first week in May. So we're going to have 2 or 3 events Monday through Friday that first week in May. And one of them will be one of the deeper dives from the Soil Builders project. And just a final thanks to our funders.